The conference room on the 14th floor smelled like fresh coffee, and something else I couldn't name at first. Tension, maybe. Or the particular kind of quiet that settles in before something irreversible happens. I sat at one end of the long oak table. My soon-to-be ex-husband, Derek, sat at the other end with his attorney. His posture was relaxed in the way people get when they're certain they've already won. He hadn't looked at me once since I walked in. That was fine. I wasn't there to be looked at. Our mediator, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Hartley, was arranging papers in front of her. Derek's attorney, a man named Greenberg who wore cufflinks shaped like tiny gavels, which I always thought said something about a person, was scrolling through his phone, not even pretending to be engaged. Derek leaned over to whisper something to Greenberg. They both smiled. I watched that smile. I knew that smile. It was the same one Derek had used 16 years ago at my sister's birthday dinner, when I mentioned I was thinking about leaving the ER to take a position in medical research. You? Research, he'd said, and then laughed, and then added, no offense, Han, but you're a people person. You need patience to fuss over. And everyone at the table laughed with him because Derek was funny. Derek was charming. Derek had a way of reducing you to a single sentence and making you feel like the reduction was a compliment. I'd spent years learning how to smile at that laugh. I wasn't smiling anymore. Miss Hartley cleared her throat and opened the session. We were there to finalize asset division, the house in Brookfield, the retirement accounts, my research stipend from the university. Derek wanted a portion of that stipend. His attorney had argued that my income from the NIH-funded project had increased significantly during our marriage, and that Derek's support of my career trajectory entitled him to a share. That was the argument. Derek had supported my career. I let that sit in the room without touching it. Greenberg began walking through their position. Derek had provided stability, had managed the household finances when I was traveling for conferences. And this one genuinely made me press my thumbnail into my palm to keep from reacting, had subordinated his own professional ambitions to accommodate Dr. Nolan's demanding schedule. Dr. Nolan. That was me, Dr. Irene Nolan. I'd been Dr. Nolan for 23 years. Chief epidemiologist on 3 federal outbreak response teams, 11 peer-reviewed publications, 2 commendations from the CDC, 1 very long and expensive divorce. Derek worked in real estate. He had, over the course of our marriage, sold an average of 8 properties per year in Fairfield County. He was good at it. He genuinely was. He had the handshake and the eye contact, and the ability to make people feel like they were getting something rare. I respected that even now, in the way you can respect something that also caused you considerable damage, but subordinated his professional ambitions. I wrote nothing on the yellow legal pad in front of me. My attorney, a woman named Patricia. No, I'm sorry. I'd used that name before in my head, rehearsing this. My attorney's name was Susan Okafor. She had short natural hair and a very quiet way of watching people that I found deeply reassuring. Susan had told me, 3 days prior, to bring the folder. She hadn't told me when to use it. She'd said I would know. I was starting to think I knew. Greenberg finished his opening position. Ms. Hartley turned to Susan, who gave a brief and measured response. I didn't track all of it. I was thinking about something Derek had said to me at a party. God, it must have been 6-7 years ago. We were at a fundraiser for the hospital. Someone had asked me what I did, and I'd started explaining the outbreak surveillance work, and Derek had put his hand on my arm and said, "She's a public health doctor. Basically, she studies why people get sick." And then he'd pivoted the conversation to the Brookfield housing market. Basically, she studies why people get sick. 23 years of work, reduced to basically. I'd thought about that moment more than I probably should have. It had lodged somewhere I couldn't reach. Ms. Hartley asked if I had anything to add to the preliminary record before we moved to the financial documents. Susan looked at me, just briefly. I opened the folder. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. I didn't slide it across the table or stand up or do anything that would look the way it might look in a film. I simply took out the first page and placed it in front of Ms. Hartley, then the second, then the third. Greenberg looked up from his notes. Derek looked up from his phone. The first page was a letter from the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, dated April 2019. The second was a commendation from the Department of Health and Human Services. The third was a summary brief from the NIH, my NIH, outlining the scope of the outbreak response program I had led from 2017 to 2022, during which time I had been the primary investigator on a surveillance network that had, according to the brief, Provided early detection frameworks credited with preventing an estimated 40,000 excess hospitalizations during 2 separate outbreak events. The room was quiet. Derek stared at the pages. I watched him read. I could tell when he hit the word director because his jaw shifted slightly to the left, a tell he'd never known he had. Greenberg set down his cufflink phone and leaned over to look. Miss Hartley was reading carefully. Her face gave nothing away, which I respected enormously. I said quietly, "I have 12 additional pages, if that would be helpful." Greenberg said, "Excuse me, can we take 5 minutes? Let me go back." Because the conference room wasn't where this really started. That room was just where it became visible. It started, I think, in 1998. I was 26 years old and finishing my residency at a University of Chicago Medical Center when I was approached by a department supervisor about a lateral move. Not into clinical practice, but into something that had no clean name at the time. They were building an early warning system for infectious disease clusters. The work was unglamorous by any conventional standard. No patients, no procedures. Long hours in front of datasets, cross-referencing hospital admission records with geographic and demographic data, trying to find the patterns that appeared before the doctors in the ER knew what they were looking at. I said yes immediately. I didn't fully understand what I was saying yes to. Not then. The first year was mostly learning how wrong our existing models were. How many assumptions we'd baked into surveillance systems that had never been seriously stress-tested. I worked with a team of 4, 2 epidemiologists, a biostatistician, and a data systems person, and we were, to be honest with you, largely ignored by the broader department. We didn't see patients, we didn't generate revenue. We existed in a hallway on the 3rd floor next to the supply closet, and most of the clinical staff walked past our office without knowing what we did. That was fine with me. I've never needed people to understand what I do while I'm doing it. What I needed was the work, and the work, once I got deep enough into it, was the most consuming thing I'd ever encountered. An outbreak doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. It shows up first as a cluster of calls to nurse hotlines, a slight uptick in school absences in a particular zip code, a pharmacist in Waukegan, noticing she's selling more pediatric fever reducers than usual. The signal is there, buried in the noise, and the only question that actually matters, is whether you can find it before the noise becomes a crisis. I became very good at finding it. Over the next 8 years, I worked my way from that supply closet hallway to a position at the Illinois Department of Public Health, then to a federal consulting role, then, in 2009, to an appointment as a senior epidemiologist at the CDC's Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases in Atlanta. My work during the 2009 H1N1 response put me in rooms I hadn't expected to be in. I gave briefings I hadn't expected to give. I made recommendations that were taken seriously by people with a great deal of authority, which was both gratifying and, I won't lie to you, frightening in a way that sharpened my thinking considerably. Derek and I met in 2006. He was charming and funny and made me laugh at a dinner party in Evanston, hosted by mutual friends. He knew nothing about epidemiology and was completely unbothered by that. He asked me questions about my work with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and then remembered the answers, which at the time I found remarkable. A lot of people asked about my work and retained nothing. We were married in 2008. For the first few years, we were good. I was traveling constantly. Atlanta, Washington, Geneva once, and Derek managed the household in ways I genuinely could not have managed without him. I want to be fair about that. He paid the bills. He coordinated our move from Chicago to Connecticut when I took the university appointment. He planned our vacations and remembered which of my colleagues' names I'd mentioned and asked about them at the right moments. He was a good partner in the practical logistics of a complicated life. But somewhere, I've tried to locate the exact moment and I can't. Somewhere the questions about my work stopped being curious and started being editorial. Do you really think your models are actually predictive? Or is it more like educated guessing? At a dinner. In front of his brother and sister-in-law. I mean, you spend all this time analyzing data, but the clinicians are the ones actually saving people, right? You're more like the support staff. Also at a dinner. Different year, same brother. I stopped bringing up my work at dinners, then I stopped bringing it up at home. Then, somewhere around year 10 of our marriage, I realized that the version of me Derek described to people, to his family, to our neighbors, to the new couples we met at neighborhood events, bore very little resemblance to what I actually did. I was a researcher, I worked in public health. I studied disease patterns. These things were technically true and completely hollow. When our neighbor Beth asked what I'd been working on and I said, "Actually, we've been tracking an unusual Legionella cluster in the Northeast," Derek said, "She gets very into the weeds. It's basically detective work but for germs." And Beth laughed and said, "Oh, that's fun," and the conversation moved on. For germs. I went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while. I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling you this to make Derek sound like a monster. He wasn't. He was a man who had, over time and without fully realizing it, decided that his wife's accomplishments were only as significant as he chose to make them. That's a quieter kind of damage than cruelty. It doesn't leave marks you can point to. It leaves something more like a slow erosion, the kind where you don't notice the cliff is smaller until you're standing at the edge. The marriage ended for a number of reasons, and I won't pretend the professional diminishment was the only one. There were other things. Distances. Choices. A fundamental disagreement about whose life we were actually building together. I'll leave the rest of it where it belongs. But when Derek's attorney filed the initial documentation for asset division, and I read the language about Derek having supported and enabled my career, something in me went very still. Not angry. Still. Because I understood then that this was going to require a different kind of response than I usually gave. Susan and I had spent 2 months preparing the folder. She'd called it the record. I liked that. A record is not an argument, it doesn't plead, it simply exists. The record included the CDC director's letter, the HHS commendation, the NIH program summary, a letter from my department chair at the university describing the funding my research had attracted, a brief written summary of the 2017 Midwest Respiratory Illness Response, in which I had served as Incident Command Coordinator, a role that involved, among other things, overseeing a team of 47 researchers and coordinating with public health departments in 6 states. It also included my curriculum vitae, 41 pages. I had never shown Derek the full CV. He knew I had one, of course he did, but I don't think he'd ever read it. Why would he? It was a document that lived in my professional world, which had gradually over 16 years become a world he had very little interest in entering. When Greenberg came back from the 5-minute break, he looked at me differently. Not with respect exactly, with recalibration. The way a navigator looks at a map after realizing he's been reading it upside down. Derek did not look at me differently. Derek was staring at the table in front of him with an expression I recognized from late-night arguments. The expression of a man who has said something he cannot unsay and is trying to calculate the damage. Miss Hartley said, very calmly, "Dr. Nolan, I think we should take some time to review this material before proceeding. Would you be agreeable to a short recess?" I said yes. In the hallway outside, Susan touched my arm and said quietly, "You doing okay?" I thought about it. "I've been okay," I said. "I've actually been okay for a while, and I meant that. Because here's what I want you to understand. The part I think gets lost in these kinds of stories, where someone's truth finally gets seen and people expect the reveal to be the victory. The folder wasn't about winning. I didn't bring it to change the outcome of the mediation, though it did affect the final settlement in ways that were fair. I didn't bring it to humiliate Derek, though I suspect it was uncomfortable for him. I didn't bring it because I needed anyone in that room to finally understand what I'd spent my career doing. I brought it because I'd spent 16 years allowing someone else to narrate my life, and I was finished. That's all. The photograph in the original version of this story, the one that changed everything, is usually a single image that says what words couldn't. Mine was 41 pages of words that said the same thing. Different format, same refusal. I am not what you decided I was. The settlement was finalized 6 weeks later. Derek did not receive a share of my research stipend. His attorney did not pursue that argument further after reviewing the documentation. I kept the Brookfield house, which I subsequently sold because I'd never particularly loved Brookfield. I'd moved there because it had good schools and I'd assumed incorrectly that we would eventually need those schools. I'm in a different city now. Smaller apartment, higher floor, better view. I kept the good coffee maker and the bookshelf I built myself from a kit in 2011 and every single one of my research binders, which take up most of the second bedroom and which I refuse to apologize for. I still work. Still do the same work. Early detection, pattern recognition, the long, slow effort of finding the signal in the noise before the noise becomes something worse. I lead a team of 12 now. We've had some good findings. A couple of papers I'm proud of. A grad student who is genuinely going to be exceptional if she doesn't get distracted by the wrong opportunities, which I try to help her navigate. My sister called me a few weeks after the mediation closed. She'd heard through family channels that it had gone well, and she wanted to know what happened. I told her about the folder, about Greenberg's face, about the 5-minute recess that stretched to 45 minutes while they recalibrated their entire position. She laughed, not meanly, but with the specific delight of someone who has watched you be underestimated for a very long time. Did you just walk in there with 41 pages and say nothing? Basically, I said, and she laughed again, and this time I laughed with her, and it felt like something I'd been holding for a long time finally put itself down. I don't think Derek is a bad person. I've thought about this carefully, the way I think about everything, and I keep arriving at the same answer. He's a person who needed someone smaller, and I kept trying to make myself fit that. That's not his fault alone. I was a willing participant in my own reduction for a long time, because it was easier than the conversation it would have required. The conversation I finally had, the one that happened in 41 pages and a conference room on the 14th floor, I should have had it years earlier. Not with Derek, with myself. About what I'd built, what it was worth, what I was willing to let someone else decide it was. There's a thing that happens in outbreak surveillance. A moment when the data tips from possible to probable, when the accumulation of small signals crosses some threshold and becomes something you can no longer ignore. We call it the inflection point. It looks different every time, but once you know what you're looking for, you recognize it. My inflection point was a dinner party in 2022. Derek had introduced me to a colleague of his, a pleasant enough man named Roger, and Roger had asked what I did, and Derek had said without pausing, "She works in public health. Infectious diseases, very behind-the-scenes stuff. Behind the scenes." I smiled at Roger. I answered his follow-up question, which was about whether I was worried about the next pandemic. I said something measured and accurate and completely unthreatening. Then I excused myself to get a glass of water I didn't want, stood in the kitchen, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes when you've been avoiding a conclusion for too long, that I was done. Not done with dinner parties, not even done with being polite, done with letting someone else stand between me and my own story. I filed the divorce papers 4 months later, and 18 months after that I sat at a long oak table on the 14th floor and put down 41 pages that said quietly, without drama, without apology, "This is who I am. This is what I've done. This is what I've always been." I waited for the room to catch up. It did.